During the Civil War, with every 3 soldiers killed in battle, 5 more died of disease. We'll look at the progress we've made since then. Medicine at War tonight on Call with the Prairie Doc. Good evening and welcome to On Call with the Prairie Doc. War is a terrible experience. It is worse if injury or illness is added. Dealing with a variety of patients and their medical problems is the job of the military physician. First, let's take a look at this week's Prairie Doc quiz question. It is a true or false question this week. During the Civil War, many unnecessary amputations were done. True or false? Viewers who call in the correct answer will be entered into a drawing to win a signed copy of our book, The Picture of Health. Each of my essays originally written for this show comes with a wonderful accompanying photograph by Dr. Judith Peterson. We'll announce the answer and the winner at the end of the show. Remember, you only have 10 minutes to get your answer in for that quiz. But we answer your questions throughout the show about medicine at war as they are called in or sent to us via Facebook or email. Call in questions to 1-888-376-6225 or send us an email to the address on the screen. Joining us tonight are Dr. Mike Pekas, retired ophthalmologist from Sioux Falls, and a flight surgeon and a pilot and a variety of all sorts of other things. And joining us via Skype is Dr. Michael Maffett from Atlanta, Georgia. He's a retired internist, anesthesiologist, and we were able to connect with him all the way down to Florida, where he's on a fishing trip with some buddies, and he was willing to give up some time to talk to us about the history of medicine through war. Thank you both for doing that. Mike, how are you doing? Michael Maffett, how are you doing down there?
I'm fine. 80 degrees in sun.
Yeah, well, sure. And you haven't started fishing yet?
Early in the morning. We'll be headed out.
And you're heading out on the freshwater creeks in Florida, not on the ocean?
No, actually, we're on the Homosassa River, which is fresh water from a large spring, but we'll be heading out into the Gulf to fish for speckled sea trout.
Okay, speckled sea trout. I've never fished for I'm not a fisherman, so I wouldn't know. Are you a fisherman, Mike?
Oh, yes.
And so have you done that?
Yes, I have.
You have? You've
Yes.
been there?
Yes. We go down there every year.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And inland fish, but speckled trout are also in brackish water too, so they're fun to catch.
Yeah, that's interesting. So one of the reasons that I asked you to be on this War and Medicine show, Mike, is I know your past military experience, and you've been involved with the military along with a lifelong history of ophthalmology. Tell us just a little bit about that.
About my war experience?
Yeah.
Well, I was a Navy trained flight surgeon and served aboard a carrier for 2 combat cruises and got quite a bit of flight time while I was on board ship. Had a lot of interesting medical experiences while I was on board ship and on land, when I was back in port. But I've always been interested in military history and military medicine.
And there's a lot here. Michael Maffett, what is it about you that made me realize that you were going to be a good expert for the show on war and medicine?
Well, Rick, I have in history, especially history of the southern United States before the Civil War, quite a bit about this. And I've written a number of magazine articles and a historical novel and whatnot about that, so kind of a hobby.
I knew it. I knew we had an expert. So let's talk a little bit about what would be the favorite issue or topic that you would like to talk about, Mike, about the war? What do you think is probably, of all the wars, what is the most important learning experience we've had from this?
Well, unfortunately, we've been cursed with warfare since man first showed up on this planet. But in necessity is the mother of invention, and when we've gotten into armed conflicts like we seem to have a lot of the time, certain needs are met by new procedures, new inventions. I think one of the major things that has emerged out of wartime medicine is treatment of emergently injured people. Started out back in the ancient times, the people that were wounded and injured on battlefields were just abandoned unless they were important people or they had a relative or a friend there that would care for them. Otherwise, they were just left. Starting in the time of Napoleon, methods became developed that allowed physicians to triage wounded people. In other words, they would go out and decide who was going to survive, who was already doomed to death, and who they could treat and save. And that was the birth of the triage system. And then they developed ways of getting these people off of the battlefield and into treatment areas like frontline hospitals and those kinds of things. Right. That Michael will probably touch on with the Civil War. But it became a very well organized and systematically performed procedure. It's developed or gone on to involve air, helicopter medevacs and those kinds of things that really led to the emergence of the golden hour, where
the golden hour,
where you can, if you get those people
within that hour,
you can save 90% of their lives.
Well, and it's the helicopters from the M.A.S.H. TV show or the movie that it was in Korea, right? That started that, and of course helicopters have continued.
It really got developed in Vietnam.
Really?
Yeah,
in Vietnam.
aerial evac, yeah.
Right. Michael, Mike Pekas talked about the issue of the Civil War and evacuating the soldiers who were injured from the field during the Civil War. What do you know about what happened during the Civil War in that regard?
Well, firstly, both sides were grossly unprepared to deal with the medical issues. 750 people died during the American War. Twice as many died of disease as from casualties. At the first battle of Bull Run or Manassas, there were no ambulances, there was no field hospital, there was no way to attend to the wounded. In fact, as Pekas talked about in medieval time, the wounded that could walk, so-called walking, walked themselves back to Washington when they got treated. The ones that couldn't stay on the battlefield and died. Over the war, they developed large hospitals to deal with mass casualties. There was an acute shortage of physicians. And of course, nurses was a new entity. And during the war, they trained thousands of new physicians. They developed very large hospitals to take care of mass casualties. All of these things came about out of necessity. Well, for example, at Antietam, combined casualties on the day were 25,000 people. So to take care of those numbers, you had to have triage and a logistics system to take care of them.
Well, I've heard that the Surgeon General during the Civil War realized the value of of getting people off of the battlefield, and he was touted as saying with his new ambulance carriages, and that's where the ambulance word came from. He got all of the living casualties off the battlefield and Antietam, which was a year into the war, and it was
Right.
Yeah, it was Antietam. Right. So that's one of the huge things that's going on in the Civil War. I've often thought about the Civil War story about anesthesia. Michael, can you tell me a little bit about anesthesia? You know, you were an internist, of course, and then you became an anesthesiologist, and I'll never forgive you for that. I'm just joking,
Please don't.
But tell us about anesthesia during Civil War.
Well, the history of anesthesia is very interesting. The first general anesthetic was performed by a man named Dr. Crawford Long in Georgia, May 30th, 1842. He was born in Georgia. Georgia didn't really have a decent medical school, and he graduated what was in the University of Georgia, where his roommate, coincidentally, was Alexander Stevens, who would become Vice President of the Confederacy. He went to Philadelphia to medical school to finish, and ether had just been discovered. And the students, they had no medical use, but students discovered if you breathed ether, you got high. And they would have these parties called ether frolic, where they would get around and sniff ether. It shows you that students really haven't changed, have they?
Yeah, yeah.
But one night, Dr. Long overdid it. He passed out. He hit his head, and when he regained consciousness, he had no memory of it. So he reasoned perhaps we could use this to do painless surgery. And he first did this in practice in a town in Georgia again in 1842. There's a misconception that most soldiers in the Civil War did not get anesthesia. In fact, about 95% did on both sides. They used chloroform, they didn't use ether. There's medical reasons for that. I'm going to talk too long to get down to amputations, but the average amputation took less than 10 minutes. So the person didn't need to be asleep that long. But most patients during the Civil War did get anesthesia. And there were actually a very small number of deaths. I think 40 some odd deaths out of 80,000 cases received anesthesia.
So it's it became a safe modality, and all these surgeons, both the North and the South, learned to cut, and mostly amputations, to do surgery, to use anesthesia, and even though they didn't have antiseptic methods, when the war was over, they all went back to their hamlets and small towns and carried that expertise and just ready for this aseptic technique that Lister brought on 10 years later.
Right, and May 30th, 1842, the day that he did the first anesthetic. May 30th is National Doctor's Day.
Is what?
It's National Doctor's Day.
Oh, wow.
Recognition of first anesthetic, yes.
Interesting.
All right, so the job of the physician in war is, of course, important, but equally important is just the management of the logistics of providing the care that is needed.
I think the one thing that we have to consider when you have individuals in a war zone, armed insurgency, whatever it may be, you have the potential for a lot of decreased public health, whether that's access to sanitation, whether that's proper food, stable food environment, and also the risk of infectious diseases that comes with that. You have individuals that may be displaced, that may need to be sheltered in tent cities or just in not their normal surroundings. And so you do risk infectious diseases when you bring a large group of people and you don't have the infrastructure for that. within Africa, you have individuals who are being displaced, and so you have refugee camps and aid organizations that are working to monitor so that we don't have large infectious disease outbreaks. But unfortunately, when you bring individuals in close proximity, you do run the risk of infectious disease transmission. So currently, what we're seeing with Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo is that there is political instability, there is armed insurgency, and that is threatening the Ebola response. So there are many aid organizations that are currently working, and unfortunately they've had to pull out of several different areas because of the large number of individuals who are working with those aid organizations and needing to maintain health and safety.
This is your program, and your questions are key to the direction of our discussion. If you have a comment or a question or a thought about this issue, this is very interesting and very different issue than we usually do, please call in your questions to 1-888-376-6225 or send us an email to ask@prairiedoc.org. Really like your questions. Well, we've had some technology advances. I mean, the technology that we had 10,000 years before Christ, it was a club. Technology during the Middle Ages was a sword. Now it's, then it was a musket ball in the Civil War, and it's advanced to all sorts of things. Mike Pekas, tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the advancement of technology, both on the technology of medicine, but the technology of the weaponry.
Well, weaponry has drastically changed over the years, and during the Civil War, the mini ball was a rifled round or projectile that had a tremendous range. I mean, they were lethal up to a mile away. And during World War I, we had exploding warheads on artillery rounds, shrapnel injuries. Lethal gas was introduced. The machine gun was introduced and drove everything into trenches. They couldn't attack anymore on a frontal basis, which they always had done. During modern warfare, we had high-velocity rifle rounds and the wounds that they caused. Hand grenades, personal explosive devices that you could deliver. And then recently, IEDs. The injuries that come out of our conflicts in the Middle East, a lot of those have been concussive injuries. They've also been shrapnel injuries, but a lot of them, people die just because of the concussion of the exploding device. And then, of course, the biggest one of all, the atomic bomb. So, I mean, technology has driven a lot of things, including the treatment that we give our patients, in our practices. When you start thinking about the eradication of yellow fever, that was done by military physicians. Malarial drugs that was developed during conflicts. A lot of the medical or tropical medicine that is practiced today was developed, during wartime situations. Penicillin, the use of penicillin.
I think about Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War in the 1850s, who developed a method with her nursing staff to take a injured soldier, clean up his wound and clean him up, give him a dry clothing, a warm bed, give him nutrition, and let him know that he was cared for. And they had 2/3 less deaths because of that nursing program, and that begat nursing throughout the rest of the world. And that's where we're at. I mean, some good things have come out of war. Michael, Can you think of good things from the Civil War in particular that have resulted?
Well, Dr. Pekas touched on those. First of all, they had no drugs then, no effective drugs. They had anesthetics, of course. They had morphine. That was about it. But they did notice with infectious diseases that quarantine helped, that removing people with infectious disease from healthy people reduced the deaths. They also set up a quarantine station down at the mouth of the Mississippi River that any ships that came in with people that had fevers and tropical fevers or whatnot would have to stay anchored down there for 30 days until everybody got well or died. And this reduced things like yellow fever tremendously. Getting back to Dr. Pekas' talk about the mini ball and the rate of amputation, most of the amputations in the Civil War were necessary. Because mini balls was a very, very big, heavy bullet, 58 caliber, had a long range. If it struck an extremity, leg or arm, it would just shatter the bone. So amputations were life-saving. That's all they could do. But all of these organizational innovations were very, very important. And then, of course, rudimentary public health measures, which, as was discussed, moved on into the construction of the Panama Canal, and the understanding of tropical diseases greatly reduced the death rate.
I think about the sepsis, and it wasn't war that brought us to understand sepsis, but boy, it was the infections that were so bad in the Civil War. They kept their saws and their knives in their boots and in their teeth because they didn't realize the infections were there, and we learned that later with Lister, and it changed everything. Mm-hmm. Go ahead. World War I, though, they had the röntgenogram, or the X-ray, which brought in a bunch of changes. Mike, what can you tell me about war and X-ray?
Well, I mean, it's a good localizing thing. I mean, you could take an X-ray and you can find where the missile is, where it is. I mean, you know, if it's impacting the spinal cord or it's where it's located. But that was very crude. I mean, you know, they really didn't have localization techniques to use that would really pinpoint where that missile was located. But other than that, I don't know if they were more sophisticated with X-ray at that point or not. I would doubt that. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the difference in injuries that from missile wounds. Like, for instance, during the Civil War, Michael was talking about the mini ball and the injury that would shatter bone. My experience when I was an intern at Camp Pendleton, we used to get individuals every night that were medevaced out of Vietnam straight to the United States. Most of the predominantly were limb injuries, and the AK-47 round was a very high velocity round, and it would take out a hunk of bone. You know, you like have 2 or 3 inches of bone that was gone. Missing. It was just gone. And so we had a heck of a time with those people getting them to heal, because they had tremendous non-union problems and osteomyelitis, and it was just horrible. So there were differences in the wounds depending on the velocity of the missile, and you know, that was something that we had to face. Well,
I wonder, you know, there's even been, I've heard this, I'm not promoting this or espousing this, but they've said that we're so good at keeping people alive now during and after injuries, that we keep people alive that will be in the nursing home and don't know what's going on for the rest of their lives, and that maybe there's a time when we should stop. And what's your comment on that, Michael? Any thoughts about being too good at bringing back a person in a war?
Gosh, well, that creeps into ethical issues. I think in an emergency situation, you really can't make those decisions. You have to do the best thing that you can do. Most injuries at the battlefield that get to the hospital, to the field hospital, what's called hypovolemic shock wasn't really understood until I think World War II. And we've made huge advances to that. And Dr. Pekas said the golden hour, that's critical. So you really don't have time to make these decisions. If someone is expired, with no vital signs, you can't resuscitate them, that's that. But usually it's just a very quick emergency decision. You do the best you can and move them up the line. Someone at some point may have to make that decision, which is very, very difficult, whether it be war or life as we know it.
Yeah, that's a tough one because
Well,
it's so quick.
That falls right into triage.
Yes.
You know, how to pick the person that is going to survive due to timely health care or health care you can deliver to that person
Right.
in a timely fashion. And those that are mortally injured or they're going to die, they do not receive care. They're comfortable, they're made comfortable, but they do not receive care because you only have a finite amount of
Manpower,
delivery,
human power.
Yep, that you can use, and you can't spend your time working on a lost cause. And so that's kind of what triage is all about.
Right. Now I'm gonna go way back to one of my favorite stories, and it really is probably the first war medicine story that I like to think about, and that is the battle where all you had were the clubs, and these kids, these fighters would end up with a caved-in head, and then after the battle, people would go along and find these people unconscious. Their head was caved in, but they were still alive. And somewhere along the line, the speculation is they drilled a hole to put the finger in so you could pull the skull out, take the pressure off the brain, which would also allow a hole to allow the bleeding to escape. This is called trephination. And it worked. It actually worked when nothing else would have. And it was one of those deals where if something works for this, then maybe it'll work for everything else. And there was even a medical school of trephination in Arabia somewhere in the Middle Ages or early Middle Ages. So we're still doing trephination. We're still drilling holes where people have subdural hematomas. And I'm sure you've done anesthesia, Michael, for people who had holes drilled in their skulls.
Oh yeah, that's a very common technique, especially for either acute or chronic bleeding in the brain.
Yeah.
And especially subdural hematomas between the skull and the brain. So yeah, do that all the time, and it's life-saving.
So I think about the modern things that are going on. I want to talk about the Red Cross. Either one of you know anything about how the Red Cross got developed or any stories there? You're not familiar? Mm-mm. Michael?
I couldn't really stick to that. I mean, I know bits and pieces, but not enough to make a coherent story.
I do know that in World War I, they started doing blood transfusions. And they would take a needle and then a tube and go direct. They'd take it from an artery from a guy over here, and they'd give it directly into the vein of a guy over there. I mean, it would be this direct blood transfusion, and the majority of time, or many times it would work, but many times it wouldn't because of the type was, the blood type was wrong. And after finding how successful it could be in saving somebody's life who was dehydrated or bleeding to death, they learned the blood typing situation. And then after that, they learned IV fluids. IV fluids have been a huge thing for the health of people through medicine, and that came from World War I.
Well, typically when a when a person is injured on the battlefield, the first person that gets to them is a corpsman or a medic, Army
Yes.
medic or a Navy corpsman. And what they do is basically they stop the bleeding by tourniquet or pressure or whatever they need to do, establish an airway, make sure that they're breathing, and start fluids. And that's it. Then they have to get them out of there as quickly as they can, because otherwise they will probably succumb to their injuries. But they get them, they medevac them out as quickly as they can. Medevacing is also based on triage. You know, the injury, the severity of the injury puts you more first in line to get out of there.
Right. I think about the helicopters in Vietnam, and we should talk about that in just a second. Physicians are no different from any other patriotic citizens when it comes to protecting our nation, but there are potential surprises when their service begins.
During the first quarter of my college, December 7th came around, and we got into World War II, and from that point, I think for a lot of us, scholastic endeavors kind of took a back seat to our everybody wanting to get into the service, get into some branch of the service. I stayed in college through December of 1942, and when I came home from college then, I ended up getting my draft notice at that point, and had to go into the Army. I really wanted to go in the Navy, but didn't make it. With the background I had in college and in my association with my father's veterinary practice, they put me in the medical department. The really challenging times are in combat, when you're receiving casualties, trying to help people who are wounded and so forth. I went through the Second Battle of Bougainville, and that was my only real exposure to combat conditions. The first 2 weeks of this battle, we treated maybe as many as 60 patients. These were all severely wounded people. Some came to us in extremis. You look at them, you knew there was no way they could survive their injuries. Our overall casualty rate, death rate, was 5%. And like I say, some of those were in extremis when they reached us. Others some died after they left our hands. We didn't hold patients. We treated them. We evacuated them to the rear just as fast as we possibly could. The only antibacterial medication we had when I went in the service in '43 were the sulfa drugs, and they were not actually bactericidal. They just interfered with the multiplication of germs in the body. So that was the only thing we had to directly treat an infection with at that time. Some infections were susceptible to it, some were not. Otherwise, things just ran their course. You were left with palliative treatment.
Well, that was Dr. Stan Allen, who was in his 90s and was one of my teachers when I rotated through Watertown in the summers when I was trying to get through medical school. Thank you, Dr. Allen. We have some questions. One viewer asked, what was the required training for an individual to be able to practice medicine during the Civil War? Michael, I've often wondered that question.
That's an interesting question. Medical education, we know it today, didn't really evolve until the latter part of the 19th century. Most medical schools were just 2 years. And the students paid up front. It was fairly expensive, so most of them graduated one way or the other. They left medical school with no clinical experience. So they usually had to sign on basically as an apprentice, or we call them interns today, or residents, with an established physician or surgeon, and then learn their craft through that. But yes, one of the big problems in the Civil War is there just weren't enough. I think there were 115 physicians in the U.S. military when the war started, and by the end of the war there were 4,000. And that means they really ramped up education. Now, I think only 1 in 5 of the physicians in the Union Army were approved to actually do amputation. So I'm not sure how they decided on who that was. I guess they more experienced folks. But going back to your question, yes, so medical education was much, much different. And in a way, less rigorous, shorter.
So it's like training on
OJT.
yeah, on the job.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can bet. But these people became very well trained in knowing how to cut and brought surgery back to every hamlet and town. And you think about medicine advancing because of the Civil War afterwards. One person asked, I'm wondering how wounds were cleaned during the Civil War. Was there any kind of cleaning before the surgical procedures?
I don't think so. They just wiped away the blood, probably the dirt. The thing is, with mini balls, a lot of times they would carry clothing, dirt, whatever was on the skin into the wound. And any wound to the chest or abdomen was usually fatal. They did have a rudimentary, a lot of these operations got gangrene, usually with either staphylococcus or streptococcus. And they would usually isolate in sort of routine, and they would, I don't exactly understand this, but they would inject a solution containing bromine around the gangrenous part, and then they would, of course, surgically excise the gangrenous part. But and then the patient either made it or they didn't. It was brutal, and of course, you go back to the science, they didn't understand what caused gangrene or wound infections, and so therefore their techniques for treating that were minimal.
Right. We have a Brookings man who asked, why are people okay when it comes to technological advances, when it comes to warfare, but reluctant when it comes to advances in medicine, for example, vaccines? Mike? That's a great comment, actually.
Yeah. Social pressure is about the only thing I can come up with as far as vaccine is concerned. I mean, there's absolutely no reason why children should not be vaccinated. And this whole myth about things in vaccines that are going to harm children is, I mean, you know better than I do, the complication rate due to vaccinations is just minimal.
Well, and then there's a measles epidemic that's life-threatening.
Yes.
Not to say that we can't survive and so on. I mean, we did for many years. I mean, I had measles. You had measles.
But it's like taking a couple of centuries worth of medical knowledge and research and just throwing it out the window. You're saying, I don't believe that.
I choose not to believe that.
I choose not to believe that.
Is veterans' health adequate in caring for today's returning soldiers? When was the VA started? Either one of you.
VA was started right after World War II, and I think it's been very, very successful. I volunteer at the VA in Sioux Falls, in the eye department there, and I can tell you that that the veterans that I care for, or the veterans that I encounter, are wonderful, wonderful people, and the care that they get is top notch. Now, there's been a lot of criticism of the VA across the United States recently, and probably some of it deserved. But for the most part, the VA system has been absolutely wonderful for our veterans. It's been very heavily impacted by the wars that we've been in recently. A lot of the injuries are long-term injuries that require long-term care, and that's difficult for any kind of a health system to deal with. But they really do a good job.
I love to hear that, and my sense is that the criticism is always an overdone deal. I mean, we can always get better, and when criticism does occur, it should be addressed, and I think they address things. Any comment from you, Dr. Maffett?
I want to go back to your discussion. I want to give you one fact that I came across. In the Union Army in the Civil War, 4,000 men died of measles. Getting back to the VA, I've worked in VA in training. I was in the Army myself in Germany. I think generally the care pretty good. I think it's uneven. And I remember some hospitals better than others, like the ones that are associated with medical schools, tertiary care are much better. But generally, I think they do a great job. They have a lot of dedicated, very hardworking people that serve our veterans who deserve the best.
Boy, I spent some time at the VA hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. Oh, wow, was that a wonderful place. Some of my favorite teachers, it makes me sad to think about having that great experience and the lovely people that were there and the wonderful nursing that occurred there. All right, how were the families of soldiers alerted to the deaths of their loved ones during the Civil War, during the Vietnam War, and in combat today? Were chaplains ever involved? So those are good questions. Let's just start with, how are the loved ones informed during the Civil War? Michael?
I've heard this story. I'm going to repeat it. But I know this for a fact. Every day, every newspaper in the North and the South, especially, would publish a list of those killed in the war. And if you had a really good day, these are local folks. These are people, because then the military units tend to draw from one geographic area. And if you had a really good day, you had 0 killed, 0 K, and that's where the term OK came from. Now, I'm not sure that's true, but I do know that the newspapers would publish. I don't know if letters were sent like they are now from various folks, but the first word came through the newspaper.
Wow. I hadn't heard that OK. I mean, I've heard a variety of OKs, but to me, isn't that interesting? 0 killed. OK.
That may be, I'll say a lot, but it's interesting.
It's very interesting.
Now, the Second World War and Vietnam War, they were all, the families were all notified by telegram. And many, many times, when possible, would be accompanied with a visit from an officer and a chaplain. But that wasn't always the case.
And that was the Vietnam War too. And what about chaplains? Do you know when chaplains began?
Oh, I have no idea, but I'm sure there were chaplains during the Civil War, I know that, and all the way through till now. One of the most interesting people, local people, it was a chaplain, was Monsignor Sampson, and he was in the 101st Airborne and jumped into Normandy. And into Arnhem in Holland, and served in Vietnam and ended up as chief of chaplains of the Army. But the thing is the chaplains were always present, and they were right on the front line. I mean, they'd have services off the hood of a Jeep right there on the front line for these.
Wow. Well, and I mean, there's where the action was going.
Mm-hmm.
Any comment about chaplaincy in World War II, Michael?
I really don't know anything about that. I think that was covered very well. And during the Civil War, I know that there were chaplains. I know that church services were held in the camp, but I don't know if there were members of the service or volunteer aid. I don't know. I just don't know.
So we have 1 minute and a half. So I want you guys to make your final remarks over this time. And I'll start with Dr. Maffett from Atlanta, Georgia, who is at his fishing camp. Any major comments that you would want to finish with, Michael?
I found something amusing. Those of us who went through the draft remember the draft qualification of 4F. And where that came from is during the Civil War, you're an infantryman and were firing a rifle, the mini ball and a set amount of powder in a paper tubular cartridge. And you would bite the top of the paper with the mini ball, pour the powder in the barrel, push the bullet in, ram it in with a ram rod, put a cap on it, and shoot it. And some soldiers could shoot 3 or 4 rounds a minute. And if you did not have your front upper 4 teeth, you could not be an infantryman because you couldn't bite off a cartridge. So the term 4F come down from that through the years.
You don't have your front 4 teeth.
I had no idea.
So, and we ran out of time.
That's fine.
Thank you both. And now for the winner of tonight's Prairie Doc quiz question. During the Civil War, many unnecessary amputations were done, true or false? And the answer is false. At the time, an amputation was a better option than trying to save a grossly infected limb, although there's some argument about that. Note that anesthesia, especially ether and chloroform, was used with minimal problems, and at the time, the physicians, surgeons were not aware of sterile technique. That came 10 years later. It was Peggy Scheidel who answered the question correctly. Thank you, Peggy, for participating, and a book will be in the mail to you soon. We'll be right back after this.
Extra, extra, read the Prairie Doc Perspectives weekly essay in your local newspaper. Over 55 newspapers across the state of South Dakota include essays written by Dr. Rick Holm covering a variety of medical and health-related topics. Ask your local paper if they print Prairie Doc Perspectives.
A.P. Callum said war is never a lasting solution for any problem. However, is that statement completely true? War through the ages has brought great advances and solutions in medicine. Perhaps the first innovation in medicine that evolved during warring times came with drilling holes through the bony skulls of warriors whose heads were smashed in by clubs. Once a hole was made, one could put a finger in and pull out the caved-in skull bone with the added benefit of providing an escape hole for bleeding, releasing pressure off the brain. There are museums that have 7,000-year-old skulls with healed-over burr holes. But this treatment, called trephination, is still done. During the 1700s and 1800s, the worldwide imperialism of the British came from their conquering navy. This was partially because the Brits knew lime and lemon juice with vitamin C prevented scurvy, which is a life-threatening progressive condition of profound weakness, gum disease, skin ulcers, and bleeding. Opposing navies riddled with scurvy had no chance against the Brits. During the Crimean War of 1850s, Florence Nightingale and her team of newly trained nurses showed how nursing made a difference. They cleaned up injured soldiers, provided a warm, dry bed, gave healing nutrition, and in general cared for the soldier, which remarkably reduced the death rate by 2/3. Nursing grew from that beginning. The Civil War brought advancement in anesthesia with easily used ether and the education of myriads of surgeons who spread their surgical skills throughout the country after the war. Also, the Civil War generated the development of the ambulance wagon, an effective method of transferring the injured from the battlefield to a place for treatment and comfort. For example, in the Battle of Antietam, every wounded living Union soldier was off the battlefield by the end of the day. During the Boer War and World War I, X-ray machines became available at portable hospitals, facilitating the repair of bony injuries. The field of orthopedics evolved as surgeons had growing trauma experience along with the aid of anesthesia and antisepsis. Also, blood transfusions and intravenous fluids came to be used during World War I and brought into reality how very sick people no longer had to die from dehydration. Civil War General William T. Sherman said, "War is cruelty, and at best barbarism. Its glory is all moonshine. War is hell." That said, war has brought grand improvements in medicine that have wrought relief of suffering during times of war and peace. Well, a great big thank you to our guest, Dr. Mike Pekas, for volunteering to come to our studio in Yeager Hall on the campus of South Dakota State University, and to Dr. Mike Maffett, who joined us via Skype from Florida. We thank them both. Your presence has made this a great, fun time to talk. That does it for tonight. From all of us here at On Call with the Prairie Doc, until next time, stay healthy out there, people. So we can talk among...
The treatment of patients is a team effort. No one person or department covers everything. How radiology helps in treatment. Next time, On Call with the Prairie Doc.
On Call with the Prairie Doc is very important to a lot of people in this area and in this region because it communicates a lot of very valuable information on healthcare, medical issues, answers specific questions. This project takes dollars. We have people in studios and we have people that have to be paid and we have to do production costs, even though Dr. Holm's time, our time, the guest time is all donated, we still have production costs. We have a great foundation called the Healing Words Foundation that oversees this whole operation and is responsible for some of the fundraising to promote these programs. If you like this program and you enjoy the information you're getting and you find it's valuable, please feel free to go to our website and donate. We would really like to have some additional financial support, and it's very simple to do. And again, it'll keep this program going for the foreseeable future. So the website is prairiedoc.org, O-R-G, prairiedoc.org. Go there, donate if you're so inclined, and we thank you very much.
Major funding for On Call with the Prairie Doc has been provided by
Avera is a proud sponsor of On Call on South Dakota Public Broadcasting.
Larson Manufacturing is proud to support On Call Television as it continues to open doors for important medical information.
The South Dakota Foundation for Medical Care, the Medicare Quality Improvement Organization for South Dakota.
and with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions.
Brookings Health Systems,
Ophthalmology Limited,
Avera Heart Hospital,
Dakota Allergy and Asthma,
Fishback Financial Corporation,
Vance Thompson Vision,
Urology Specialists,
Brown Clinic,
American Academy of Family Physicians, Foundation and South Dakota Academy of Family Physicians,
Black Hills Medical Society,
Aberdeen District Medical Society,
3rd District Medical Society,
7th District Medical Society,
Dakota Bank,
Orthopedic Institute,
Physicians Care Sanford Clinic Community Service Committee,
Aberdeen Asthma and Allergy,
and Swiftel Communications.